Hey guys, this is Khavrion here with another battle report. This is for infiNity Global League January 2023 Satellite Event, Round 4. And it will feature me as Steel Phalanx against Kthuluist as Combined Army in a game of Frostbite. A comment on the whole Round 4 thing, I've been pretty busy in real life, so I haven't actually made battle reports for any other games in this league yet. And while I might get around to doing so for the other rounds, I wanted to do this one because I wanted to talk about Norkius and Frostbite. So if things seem out of order to you, well, sorry in advance for that. The only other thing I'll say about the IGL season at this point is that I have actually already lost one game as of this round. In the previous round, in round 3, I lost to Norkius, who would go on to win the whole of the event, so congratulations to him for that. And also be aware that as of round 4, I am not in the running to win the whole thing, and so I am feeling, a little bit more willing to experiment. That being said, let's dive into the matchup. Frostbite is a well-loved mission with a long history in ITS. And to my understanding, a whole lot of people consider it to be one of the better, more balanced missions from a competitive perspective. It balances having a whole bunch of special rules that require you to play differently for it, while also allowing a whole lot of different strategies that are potentially viable. Historically speaking, it has also done a really good job of balancing advantage for first turn with advantage for going last. And it balances a healthy dose of killing and area control with the need for pushing buttons. And probably all these reasons contribute to why people like Frostbite in competitive events so much. That said, the changes in Frostbite from ITS 13 to ITS 14 had a very big impact on both this game and other games of Frostbite in ITS 14 that I've played. And I did want to talk about how those changes affected my games, which is why I'm making this battle report. So what's going on in Frostbite? Mission objectives have a fair spread of things. You've got to kill more army points. You've got to dominate the exclusion zone. You've got to have at least as many heating units turned on as your opponent, or more if you can. And in this version, you've got 2 classified objectives. On top of that, we have a number of scenario-specific special rules, which help tie these different objectives together and make for interesting strategy. Chief amongst these special rules is the Killer Cold rule. Basically, in Killer Cold, the whole board is so cold that you're going to die unless you can heat yourself up. How do you heat yourself up? Well, some troopers are able to heat themselves naturally. That's heavy infantry, remotes, tags, or the season-specific version of the data tracker called the Master Breacher. Or you have to be in a zone that has an active heating unit. Everyone else will freeze to death, hence why this mission is called Frostbite. What this Killer Cold rule does is it provides the first connection between our disparate army conditions. For starters, hopefully we're seeing how it connects the activate heating units with the army points part of the mission. If you don't turn on heating units, or, as we'll see later, if you blow up your opponent's heating units, then their troopers will freeze to death, and that'll give you an advantage in army points. Another thing it does is it means that if you want to dominate the exclusion zone, you have to be a heavy infantry, remote, tag, or season-specific version of the data tracker. Naturally, this informs your list building strategy because to dominate the exclusion zone, you need to be sure to bring enough heavy infantry, remotes, or tags. But it also informs your gameplay strategy because if you want to stop your opponent from contesting the exclusion zone, you don't need to shatter their entire army, you just need to kill their expensive heavy infantry, remotes, and tags. There's also an army points tie-in here because heavy infantry, tags, and troopers chosen as the Master Breacher tend to be on the more unique and more expensive side. Not always, but generally. All in all, hopefully we're seeing how the Killer Cold special rule enables strategies that tie together your different ways of scoring objective points. Next up are the heating units and consoles. I'm looking at the map here because, as we can see, there are 3 consoles across the center, that's the green dots, and there are 4 heating units, the sort of orange dots, located 2 per opponent's half the table edge. If you turn on a heating unit, the units in the affected zone will not die, and to turn on a unit, you have to run up and push a console. Pretty straightforward, but what is different about the consoles in this mission is that they are exclusive. Each console can only be used to turn on one heating unit. What that means is that if I push a button to turn on a heating unit, my opponent cannot push that button to turn on a different heating unit. The pigeonhole principle will say that there are 3 buttons and 4 things to turn on, which means that at least one of these things isn't getting turned on. Moreover, if you push some buttons early on, you can potentially vector your defenses of the 3rd console because your opponent will now have to go out and push that button. As a final comment, the heating units can actually be destroyed. They've got 3 structure and armor 2 and can only be affected by anti-material close combat attacks, so it's not necessarily easy to destroy these things. But if you can get an expensive trooper across the board and destroy your opponent's heating units, then they are potentially going to, be sad because their console is no longer turned on. This ties in nicely with army kills, because if your opponent has decided to just null deploy everything and not provide any defenses, well, then you can run up, blow up their heating units, and their troopers will freeze to death at the end of the mission. It doesn't happen all that often in practice that heating units get destroyed, but the pressure that is caused by the potential for them to get destroyed is worth keeping in mind. So, as far as special rules go, we have Killer Cold, which means you might freeze to death and makes it harder to dominate the exclusion zone. You've got buttons to push, but they are exclusive, so getting there early is nice. And you've got heating units that can be destroyed, so even if your opponent turns them on, well, you can then go out and blow up their heating units. Lots of different things to do, lots of different ways to do it, lots of ways to score points, and they're all held nicely together by the special rules. That's why Frostbite has been such an interesting and liked mission in its various versions across the various seasons of ITS. So what about ITS 14? What changed here? Well, the biggest change is that now you get 3 points for having more active heating units than your opponent, and 2 points if you have the same number of active heating units. In previous seasons, I think you just got 1 point for turning on 1 heating unit, and nothing if you had more or anything like that. The remaining points were thus spread among army kills and I forget what else. But in ITS 14, you get a whopping 3 points that cannot be shared with your opponent if you get more active heating units. That's a lot of points. The other thing that caught my eye about this change is that we recall that the consoles are exclusive. If I push a button on one console and turn one of the heating units on, then my opponent cannot use that console to turn something else on. So if I go first and I push 2 buttons, I've turned on both of my heating units, and my opponent now can only turn on one of theirs. This gives me a huge advantage in terms of the active heating unit 3 points thing. It's not a surefire thing, because my opponent could, in principle, turn on one of their own heating units, then blow up one of my heating units, and now we tie and get 2 points. But it is asymmetric and favors the person who pushes the buttons early, because blowing up a heating unit is substantially harder than pushing the second button. And if you do all the effort of blowing up the heating unit, then all that's going to happen is that we both tie and get 2 points. And if you go first and you push all 3 buttons, then you'll turn on both of your heating units, and you'll turn on one of the heating units in your opponent's zone. That'll still count as yours, I think, though, and that does mean that you are surefire able to get the 3 points for active heating units. That's not actually a good strategy, or at least I tried it in this game and I thought it was a dumb strategy, but it is something that is potentially able to happen. And it highlights the point that the person who's going first has an advantage in pushing the buttons early on, and also having pushed those buttons has a real serious advantage in terms of having more heating units than the opponent. That's a pretty serious change from versions of Frostbite in previous seasons of ITS. Is it a good change? In my limited experience playing Frostbite in ITS 14, not really. The problem is that it encourages a non-interactive playstyle. In particular, in all the games of Frostbite that I've played in ITS 14, which hasn't been that many, but in all the games that I've played, the person going first has prioritized pushing 2 or 3 of the buttons, and then has used the security of those 3 objective points to kind of ignore the 3 objective points from the exclusion zone. So, where in previous seasons, Frostbite has typically ended with a song and dance in which the first player wants to try to dominate the exclusion zone, but doesn't want to put so many points into the center that they risk losing those points and thus losing the army kills. In all the games of ITS 14, the person going first has, put some points into the exclusion zone, but not so many that they would actually risk losing army points. And the reason they're able to take this lukewarm approach to dominating the exclusion zone is because they're confident that even if their opponent dominates the exclusion zone, they're, going to have the active heating units for 3 points themselves. In other words, the shift to having the active heating units be 3 objective points that are fairly safe for the person who scores them first has made Frostbite a less interactive mission and less tightly held together. In my opinion, that's kind of a shame. That said, I've only played a handful of ITS 14 Frostbite games, so I do not think that every game of ITS 14 is going to be dominated by this fact, and I'm not even sure that most games of ITS 14 Frostbite are going to be dominated by this change. I just haven't played enough to be sure. All I can say is that in the games that I have played so far, I've been kind of disappointed with the change. It remains to be seen how impactful that's going to be in the long run. Next up, lists. We'll start with mine. I am running a 2 Inomatargos Big Boy adjacent list that is pretty similar to the kinds of things that I've been running recently, but which features Atalanta. In Group 1, you have Oideros, Akmon, and Pandora. These guys form a lean 3-man core team. And then you've got a Myrmidon, Machaon, Phoenix, and Ajax. Usually those 4 hang out together and form a more defensive link. Hopefully there's nothing too surprising there. I think these guys are all really solid pieces that play really well together. I was a little bit nervous when I first played this list about having only 3 dudes together to form a link team. I am used to having 4 members, and if you have only 3 members, you don't have 6th Sense, and you just have a little bit less chunk moving together up the board and able to protect each other. Like, if one person dies, then the whole link is now down to only burst 1 in arrow, which can be a pretty big deal. But having played this list a whole bunch, I took it to a 5-round event in person and won with basically using just this list. I've now come to appreciate that the 3-man team is, pretty solid. Other than all those classics, we do have 2 net rods, some probots, and then some flash pulses in Group 2, and of course, Atalanta. Specifically, Hidden Deployment Atalanta. Those of you who watched my Sectorial Cup videos are aware of how salty I was about having Atalanta in Hidden Deployment in Group 1. And I absolutely stand by how awkward that all felt. Atalanta in Group 1 was supposed to be, Hidden Deployment so she keeps herself safe and then have lots of, active turn orders to shoot stuff if that's what she wants to do. But in practice, I just left her in Hidden Deployment and then she was sucking out 1 order from the main combat group. So Hidden Deployment Atalanta is right out. But what should go in to do that job? Well, one option is to have an Agema missile launcher in Group 2. I also ran one of those in the Sectorial Cup, and in that context, and I think just in general, they are basically a pure trap card. They're going to reveal, they're going to shoot at a thing, maybe they paste a link, maybe they completely whiff and get smoked by a tag. It's a trap card, and if you can afford the points for the trap card, that's what you're getting. But they have no active turn reliability in terms of shooting, and even in ARO, when they reveal, they're only going to be shooting on a 13, maybe a 16 if you're out of cover, and they're going to be relying on the template in order to have an impact. That will obviously be impactful a lot of the time, but given that his sole purpose in life is to reveal and shoot once, every percentage point in which he could miss is going to negatively impact his effectiveness in some games. Also, the missile launcher range bands can be a little bit awkward. You're at +3, 24 inches out, but 24 inches is actually pretty long, and so being able to get +3 at 16 inches would be better. So for all these reasons, I'm going to give the Agema missile launcher a pass. The next obvious choice would be the total reaction version of Atalanta. She is extremely famous. I mean, she shoots burst 2 on 18s in ARO. I think that's better than basically anything else in the game in practice. But she also has a lot of well-known and well-discussed flaws. Obviously, for starters, she is not in Hidden Deployment, so your opponent could toss a Fide or a Speculo at her. Moreover, your opponent can kind of avoid her. In ARO, she has known lines of fire, which they can kind of avoid, and when it's active turn, they can predict where Atalanta is going to be able to shoot and avoid those too. So for example, if we were doing a mirror match and my opponent had the total reaction Atalanta, I could probably put Phoenix somewhere where Atalanta wouldn't be able to get to see Phoenix very easily, but he'd still have some ARO potential. The other well-known flaw of Atalanta is that for all her skill and her burst are the best defenses in the game, the fact of the matter is that the odds that she has aren't actually that great. Consider for a moment a active turn Harris-linked Fusilier, so a burst 5 BS-12 HMG, shooting at Atalanta from within 32 inches, so mutually good range. In this matchup, the Fusilier has a 28% chance of taking out Atalanta versus a 48% chance of dying himself. Obviously, those odds are absolutely dreadful for the Fusilier. The active turn player would really be well advised not to, take that fight if he had any alternatives. However, as the Atalanta player, the odds are also not that great for you. Sure, you've got a 48% chance of killing your opposition, but you've got a 28% chance of going down yourself. If it were your active turn, and you had a situation with those odds, I would say you'd be advised to find another way if you could. It's just too likely that you'd get unlucky and get knocked unconscious. And these are the numbers for a Harris-linked Fusilier, hardly the most impressive of active turn pieces. If we instead take a Salamandra tag in the same situation, the tag is going to have a 38% chance of knocking out Atalanta versus a 20% chance of taking a wound in and of itself. 20% chance to take a wound is pretty high as far as defending against a Salamandra goes, but it's got 3 wounds, and Atalanta's going to go down before the Salamandra gets taken out. All of which is to say, while Atalanta may be the most likely defender to wound their opponent in a straight-up face-to-face, defenders in infiNity simply don't have great odds at actually doing that. The active player has a major burst advantage. They also have a major advantage in terms of choosing which pieces they want to activate. And this all adds up to mean that you've got to be very careful about what you're going to rely on Atalanta to do. And so if what we want is reliable active turn use and reliable ARO use, then I actually think that Hidden Deployment Atalanta is better than Total Reaction Atalanta. Not better at winning face-to-faces, but better at having a reliable impact on the game. Let me explain. In active turn, your opponent doesn't know where she is, thus they can't hide from her as easily. If she's on the table, their opponent has to lie down everything that she might see. If she's off the table, your opponent has to lie down everything, period. That's a relatively small advantage that goes away as soon as she appears, but it's something to keep in mind. Moreover, when defending, while Total Reaction Atalanta might win a face-to-face and kill everything, Hidden Deployment Atalanta can reveal, target something, and very reliably inflict damage on it. Obviously nothing is surefire, but a BS-18 double-action shock round is pretty darn good. And because it has shock, it's actually better against a narrow but important category of targets than the Agema missile launcher. If I want to reveal and remove a Dartok, or a Pandora, or a Bereed hacker who's about to throw a pitcher at me from the table, then I'd rather have double action shock than have explosive missiles. You might think that that's small potatoes, and I'd be inclined to agree with you, but it does mean that Hidden Deployment Atalanta is a little bit better than Agema Missile Launcher and Total Reaction Atalanta in the way that I intend to use her. As a last commentary, Atalanta in Hidden Deployment sitting in Group 2 is not going to eat up slots in Group 1, so none of my Sectorial Cup complaints. And because she costs 40 points, she is somewhat indistinguishable from being 2 20-point Ectromoid drop troops. You can actually see me reference this fact when I named this the 2x Ectromoid meme list. The title is a joke, but the joke is you don't know if I have Atalanta or 2 Ectromoid. It's probably Atalanta, but you don't know. And while that fact is mostly useful as a joke, like it was intended as a joke here, right? I printed this out, it was an in-person event, and I handed my opponent the courtesy list and they could see the name. It's still something that your opponent has to think about, and that's, not nothing. It may be only barely more than nothing, but it's not nothing. Thus, in summary, I like Hidden Deployment Atalanta because 1, she is a little bit better in the active turn than Total Reaction Atalanta. 2, she is a little bit better than the Agema Missile Launcher against a certain category of targets. 3, she is good enough as a trap card compared to the Agema Missile Launcher against the other categories. And 4, she can sit safely in ARO in Group 2 without having to have me think too much about her. And I can say, having run this list a whole bunch, all of those principles have worked themselves out. I have revealed Atalanta and sniped Pandora. I have revealed Atalanta and sniped a Dartok. I have kept Atalanta in Hidden Deployment for the whole game and had my opponent sweat bullets running around in marker state. I have revealed her to shoot at flash pulse bots. I have revealed her to lose a face-to-face against a Suryat at bad range and then Atalanta burned to death. In basically all of these situations, I was happier that I had Atalanta Hidden Deployment in Group 2 than I would have been to have anything else in that sort of role. And because I've enjoyed that so much, I have found myself reaching for this list fairly often. Anyway, enough about my list. Let's talk about my opponent's list. My opponent has taken what I consider to be a fairly standard combined army list anchored around Sheskeen and Norkius. What that means is that you obviously have Sheskeen and Norkius, but you also have Bit and Kiss because they're awesome, the M drone because it's, giving advantages in this season, the T drone because you have Bit and Kiss, a hacker that can spotlight in order to go along with Bit and Kiss. In this case, my opponent has chosen the Mentor hacker, probably for counterintelligence, but the Shrouded hacker is also pretty common. You've then got a Liberto because they're good, 2 Imitrons because why not, a Dalarazi because they're good, Caliban Chain of Command because he is a midfield button-pushing specialist and also Chain of Command, Taiga because that's pretty good, and a Gryphop, again, because it's pretty good. This isn't everything. There are some flex picks that I think are non-standard. We've already talked about how the Mentor is kind of non-standard in this one. I think Ada is also kind of non-standard in this one. But these pieces are relatively inexpensive and pretty darn solid, so I don't think that they make this list deviate all that much from the usual Sheskeen Norkius list picks. What I will say, though, is that in this particular matchup, there is something of a lack of pieces that can really threaten Steel Phalanx. Obviously, you have Bit and Kiss and the T-Drone, which are going to be able to do spotlight stuff, but aside from that, the only really serious gun is Sheskeen. And while Sheskeen is really good in general, I think she's not great into Steel Phalanx. In particular, I think Phoenix is going to give her a real problem. Phoenix has Mimetism -6 and a decent range band, so she can't just reliably win the face-to-face against him. And he's got a heavy rocket launcher with fire. She's only got Armor 1 and relies heavily on that nano screen in order to absorb damage. So if Phoenix wins to face-to-face, then Sheskeen has a very good chance of burning and dying. Thus, while this list archetype is strong, and I think this list in general may be strong, I think it will struggle against Steel Phalanx in particular. With that underway, let's go ahead and talk about the mission. I win the die roll and decide to go first, and I am going to try a sort of unusual strategy. I'm not sure I'd recommend it, but I wanted to give it a try. Because I had lost my previous game and been knocked out of winning this event overall, I am more willing to try something experimental and see how it goes. Taking you through my deployment, I have Myrmidon, Machaon, Ajax, and Phoenix. He's up here. I have a Netrod and a Netrod. I have a Flashpulse spot here, Flashpulse spot here, Warcore here. Atalanta, I think, is on this corner, although she might have been on this corner. And then we have the 3-man Anomatarkos over here with Oideros, Akmon, and Pandora. Meanwhile, using this picture, my opponent has, I think this is a Liberto, I think this is a Caliban. The Liberto's mine is out here. We have an Imitron there. The other Imitron is behind this building. Tiger Creature, Dalarazi. This is the Mentor. This is the Mentor's Decoy, Missile Launcher Bot, M-Drone, Sheskeen, and then Norkius is tucked, I think, right there, and the Ichadron is tucked, I think, right there. You can get a better view of the Ichadron and Norkius from this picture, and you can also see the Gryphop operator, which was my opponent's withheld piece right there. One other piece that I'm realizing I didn't mention is Ada. She is somewhere in here, and this is her viral mine. It is my turn to go first, so let's dive into that. The first thing I'm thinking is that my opponent has virtually no ARO that is contesting this midfield. There is the Gryphop, who is right here, but aside from that, the only thing that is presenting any line of fire whatsoever is Kiss, who I think is right there, or maybe who's in the building. Consequently, what I am going to try is a strategy in which I push all 3 buttons, here, here, and here. That will let me turn on 3 heating units, and it will completely deny my opponent's ability to get any of the points associated with heating units. I will turn on 1 heating unit for my opponent, which is this one, but that I think is a, sort of an inconvenience for him because he would really like this heating unit to be turned on. If I can then push all 3 buttons, that gives me 3 points, and I can focus entirely on keeping my army alive. 3 points for heating units, 2 points for army kills, maybe I get my classifieds. That gets me enough points that I can safely ignore the exclusion zone. And I'm thinking that that is going to be the right strategy. In hindsight, I think it would have been better just to push these 2 buttons. It would have been easier and would have given me the chance to score a few more kills. And moreover, it would have forced my opponent to come out here and push this button in order to avoid freezing to death. Those 3 points are still pretty safe because in order to even have a hope of getting 2 of those 3 points, he'd have to destroy one of my heating units. And so I think it would have been better to not do this strategy. Still, it's the one I'm going to pursue. It pretty much works out exactly. I take these guys, I run more or less all through this way, I push all 3 buttons, and I camp out defensively here. Oideros is going to provoke an unopposed combi rifle shot from the Gryphop operator here and take a wound from it, which is kind of annoying, but I do manage to kill the Gryphop. Thus, at the end of my turn, the situation looks like this. Here's Oideros, Akmon's downstairs, Pandora's back here, and, well, you can see that I've pushed all 3 buttons. I've turned on this heating unit, and this heating unit. My opponent then looks at my situation and thinks that I'm pretty well castled. He realizes correctly that he doesn't have any guns that can really contest me, and so falls back on the old Bit and Kiss special of guided missiles. It's a little disappointing that this is the right strategy because guided missile is super non-interactive, but my strategy has basically been to push 3 buttons and force a non-interaction throughout the whole game, so what do you expect? Anyway, what happens is I think Kiss runs to here, a pitcher is put here, and my opponent starts to use Norkius in order to Trinity Pandora to death. What follows is pretty much farcical bad luck on the part of my opponent. He spends something like 5 or 6 or 7 orders attempting to Trinity Pandora, and throughout that process only manages to put her NWI. Now, NWI is, not nothing, and Zero Pain is a pretty good defensive program, but the fact of the matter is that my opponent was firing 3 dice that deal damage, I was shooting back with only 2 dice, and I only had BTS-3. I really should have died a lot sooner. Still, it doesn't work out that way. What does instead happen is that Pandora just goes NWI, and as sort of a last-ditch effort, my opponent decides he wants to isolate Ajax and isolate Pandora because that's what he needs to do with his mentor. So he activates the mentor, he throws an Oblivion at Ajax, he throws an Oblivion at Pandora. The one on Pandora works. Pandora is isolated, but Ajax manages to survive. He then targets Ajax. That's successful. Ajax is targeted. He tries to drop a missile on Ajax's head, and Ajax manages to dodge within 2 inches of the repeater. A whole bunch of orders have been spent. Not much has been accomplished. This brings us to my turn, and I'm going to use the same picture because not much has changed. I have a couple of options, but my strategy here is to go as non-interactive as possible. So what I'm going to do is spend my entire turn killing the repeater over here, and then getting these guys into a more defensive position. Throughout that process, I also want to engineer Ajax, and I want to engineer Akmon. Again, in hindsight, I think now would have been a really good time to attack. This is turn 2, which means the next one is turn 3. And one of the problems with attacking on turn 3 is that you have to get back to safety or your guys will freeze. I would love to be able to take some link, maybe the link with Ajax, and run it over to this position, and then get line of fire on Shaskin, who's right there. But I am not able to do that because instead I choose to repair the damage. So I use this picture to describe the state of things at the end of my opponent's turn 1, and it is also a good picture for the state of things at the end of my turn 2. The only thing that is important is that Oideros and Pandora and the rest have moved over so that they are in the midfield. I think Pandora is back here and Oideros is over here. This brings us to my opponent's turn 2, which is when he decides to activate Norkius. This Norkius activation is actually one of the major reasons I wanted to make this battle report, because it showcases why I do not feel that Norkius is overpowered. A lot of people look at Norkius' profile and see his close combat attack +1 burst, his CC of 20 kajillion, his monofilament, and his EM close combat weapons, and rightly conclude that this guy is amazingly deadly in close combat, and I completely agree. Moreover, if he gets a chance to fuel up with Prothyon, he can become really tough, and that can just make him even harder to deal with. These are all very real strengths, and I in no way mean to say that they are not strengths. However, focusing on his ability to be super effective in close combat misses the point that he is fundamentally a unit that moves about 8 inches per order who is not that good of a shooter. Thus, if all he is doing is walking across the battlefield, he has to be extra careful to avoid AROs, and if he does have to shoot something, he doesn't have great odds of actually making it work. With that in mind, let's talk about what happens. Norkius starts here, he goes into marker state, and then he spends a whole bunch of orders walking across the battlefield to this position. Through that process, he gets exposed to this flashball spot, this flashball spot, and this flashball spot, but unfortunately, all 3 of them fail their discovers. Had Norkius been discovered, he would have been able to remarker state up, but it would have further slowed him down. This also prevents him from being able to dodge, because if he dodges, he loses marker state. Consequently, Norkius is basically moving 8 inches per order with no potential for extra efficiency. He's getting nothing more done than a 4-4 Fusilier in these orders. Once he arrives, he's going to try to start shooting things. This picture is from the end of my turn 3, but it shows the relevant pieces. You have Oideros here, Akmon here, and Pandora was in this position. The Warcore was up here, still alive, and Atalanta was in hidden deployment. Odoros and Akmon haven't moved, so that makes this picture pretty good. So what happens? Well, Norkius has come in from this position and has spent a whole bunch of orders getting here. He then decides to run to this position and wants to start fighting things. The problem is that the Warcore is present and he's got to kill that thing first. Remember that comparison to the Fusilier? Well, Norkius is no better at killing a Warcore than a Fusilier with a combi rifle. They're both BS-12 and they're both firing damage 13 guns. Thus, it is a little bit unfortunate, but not terribly surprising, that the Warcore simply doesn't die through this process. I mean, he's obviously not there at the present, but actually that's because he has climbed downstairs, not because he's died overall. So yeah, Norkius simply cannot beat this silly little Warcore in a face-to-face. As a result, he can't risk getting into CC without the threat of existential stopping of his run caused by the flash pulse up here. If he CCs Orderos, yes, he probably wins, but he's getting shot by Akmon, he's getting stunned by the flash pulse spot, and it's only burst 2 versus burst 1, so who knows how this will go. So instead of doing that, he tries some trickery. He manages to get in this position. He provokes a shooting arrow from Odoros. I think Odoros shoots him with burst 2 nanopulsars, and then he Trinities Pandora. This finally kills Pandora. I think it was a good call. My opponent correctly realized that if Pandora had Zero Pain or Oblivion, then she would get kicked out of the link. But I wasn't expecting Pandora to die in, one single volley of Trinity. There's a 25% chance that Orderos' burst 2 nanopulsars will kill Norkius outright. He only takes a wound in the process, but his attack run is pretty much stopped at this point. In fact, I think the only thing that he does is he tries a Hail Mary attack with Norkius on Orderos. I don't remember exactly what he does, but maybe he comes around the corner and tries to use the Vorpal close combat weapon. Again, I don't exactly remember what happens. All that I do know is that Norkius is just killed. And in my opinion, this is not that unreasonable in terms of Norkius. The thing is that because I had my troopers watching each other, and there was a lot of troopers watching each other, he couldn't risk actually getting into close combat without eating burst 2 arrows that would really threaten him. The flash pulses in particular are very dangerous. Moreover, because he can't shoot, he had no choice but to walk relatively slowly across the entirety of the battlefield before he could actually fight. For all these reasons, his attack run was really only successful in killing Pandora, and in my opinion, that took a little bit of luck. Now, it is true that Steel Phalanx is particularly robust against Norkius' attacks. We're all really good at CC, we have a lot of wounds and mimetism, but these principles didn't even come into play. All that really mattered was the fact that I was watching my own dudes and relying on the fact that Norkius can't shoot. Thus, I think this situation demonstrates why I feel that Norkius is not overpowered. To be clear, he's still really, really good. He is very deadly in close combat, he has a lot of skills that are really useful, but he also has some weaknesses which can be exploited that can slow down his offensive capacity, and really the counterplay is something that is generally available, which is good ARO. So for these reasons, I don't think any trooper is truly overpowered if the sorts of things that shut it down are ubiquitous like flash pulses and good deployment. Norkius is deadly in close combat, but he can't shoot, and he's kind of slow. With that in mind, I think we can pretty much accelerate towards the end of the battle report. Here are how things stand at the end of my turn 3. What I've tried to do is come up here and attack. Sheskeen had moved over here for some reason, but she was able to dodge to safety here, so I have to then retreat, or else everybody will freeze. I probably could have stayed in this zone and not died, but I am concerned that if I do that, I'm very close to Sheskeen, who, for all my bad-mouthing of her, is still very tough. So what I do instead is I put Ajax here, he's in the point zone, Machaon is down there, he's my data tracker, he's also in the point zone, and that's pretty much it. My opponent's turn is fairly straightforward. Sheskeen is going to run over here and fight Ajax and fight the Flash Pulse bot. This goes surprisingly and unexpectedly well. The first thing that happens is both Sheskeen and Ajax end up taking a wound. If I ran the numbers on this, because Sheskeen is splitting burst, it's actually more likely that Sheskeen gets wounded than Ajax. So Sheskeen taking a wound and Ajax taking a wound is mildly lucky for my opponent. But in the moment, he feels like he's getting really unlucky, and I sympathize. The next thing that happens is he takes this M drone, runs over here, and shoots at Ajax, and shockingly, the M drone manages to put 2 wounds on Ajax and kill him. With that accomplished, Shaskin, who had actually gotten stunned in addition to everything else, is able to run out here, dodge. She's got to dodge in order to avoid Phoenix's arrow. Phoenix is, I don't know, somewhere over here. And she dodges and gets into the zone. Thus, in conclusion, my opponent is able to dominate the zone, but I have more heating units, I have killed more points, and I don't remember, but I think I got at least one of my classifieds. Thus, the game concludes in a fairly big win for Steel Phalanx. To give this a post-mortem, I chose a strategy that involved pushing buttons early and then non-interacting. In retrospect, I probably wouldn't pursue that strategy. However, a related strategy in which I push 2 buttons, do some extra damage, and then try to not interact, I think that strategy might have worked. On the other hand, my opponent tried to rely on guided missile strikes, got unlucky, tried to use Norkius, found him to be, in my opinion, not efficient enough because of the reasons we've discussed, and then finally relied on Shaskin and the M-drone to shoot at Ajax, which was moderately successful. My prediction that Shaskin would suffer because she can't quite outshoot Steel Phalanx was more or less true. She really could not outgun Ajax, and the fact that Ajax died is somewhat surprising. But even with the luck that he had, it wasn't enough to get him the points that he needed to overpower me on army points. That pretty much wraps things up. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you around.